The radio crackled once, then went silent. 11 men were pinned behind a collapsed mud wall in the eastern Kandahar Valley, taking fire from multiple positions they couldn't see. The team leader was down. The communications specialist had a shattered shoulder. 3 others were bleeding. The extraction helicopter was 17 minutes out, and the enemy was moving in from 3 directions, cutting off every possible retreat route. It was the kind of situation that ends careers. The kind that fills casualty reports. The kind where even experienced operators admit, quietly and only later, that they didn't see a way out. And then, over the encrypted channel, a voice came through. Calm. Precise. Measuring the situation in real time. I have eyes on the eastern ridge. Don't move. Give me 4 minutes. That voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Mara Calloway. 31 years old. Naval Special Warfare. One of the first women to serve in a combat-integrated SEAL support command role. A sniper with a confirmed record that most male operators in her unit had never matched. And a woman who had been quietly, persistently, and systematically underestimated from the first day she entered a building that wasn't built with her in mind. What happened over the next 5 minutes in that valley would be documented, analyzed, and spoken about in military debrief rooms for years. 12 enemy combatants. 5 minutes. 11 lives saved. The number isn't what makes the story remarkable. What makes it remarkable is everything that came before that moment. The years of silence. The quiet endurance. The relentless preparation that nobody applauded. The weight of being the woman in the room who always had to prove that she belonged there. Because the shot that saves a life is only possible if you've spent 1,000 cold mornings preparing to take it. So ask yourself this: when was the last time you underestimated someone standing right next to you? This is Mara Calloway's story. She didn't grow up wanting to be a soldier. That matters, because the stories that are the most honest rarely begin with a childhood dream about uniforms. Mara Calloway grew up in rural Pennsylvania, the second of 3 daughters born to a former Marine father and a schoolteacher mother who both believed, with quiet but unyielding conviction, that hard work and accuracy were the only 2 things in life that were never wasted. Her father didn't teach her to shoot because he wanted a son. He taught her because she asked, and because when she asked, he could already see in the way she held still and focused that she had something he couldn't name but recognized immediately. She was 11 years old the first time she fired a rifle. She didn't flinch. She adjusted her breathing the way she'd watched her father do, and she hit the target on the second shot. By 13, she was consistently outscoring her father at 200 yards. He never said much about it, but he started waking up earlier on weekends so they could get more range time before the light changed. She was not a reckless kid. She was not loud or aggressive or the kind of girl who needed to announce herself in a room. She was the one who watched, who listened, who measured situations before she acted. Teachers noticed it. Coaches noticed it. Her father noticed it most. He told her mother once, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, that Mara saw things before they happened. Her mother said that sounded like anxiety. Her father said it sounded like a gift they should be careful not to waste. She went to college on an Rock Scholarship. Engineering major. She was methodical, technically minded, and sharply competitive in the way that people who never announce their ambitions tend to be. She didn't walk into ROTC with a chip on her shoulder. She walked in with a notebook full of questions about how systems worked and a patience for answering those questions through repetition that most of her peers didn't understand. She was commissioned as a naval officer at 22. Her performance evaluations from her earliest days in uniform described her with words like composed, detail-oriented, and exceptionally precise under pressure. The evaluations were positive but not glowing. Nobody was writing about her with the kind of language that opens doors. She was excellent, and excellent was easy to overlook when excellence didn't come packaged in the expected form. She applied for Naval Special Warfare training the year the integration policy changed, making certain specialized roles within the SEAL command structure accessible to female officers who met the qualification standards. She did not apply because she needed to make a statement. She applied because she had spent 6 years developing a skill set that fit exactly the kind of work those units required, and because something in her, deep and steady and unhurried, told her she was built for this level of precision. The day her application was accepted, she didn't celebrate. She went to the range and put 200 rounds downrange, adjusting her breathing and her hold and the small mechanical details that separate a good shot from a mission-critical one. She was already thinking about the gap between where she was and where she needed to be. That gap, and the relentless effort she poured into closing it, would define everything that came next. The training pipeline for special warfare support integration was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to find the precise edge where a person discovers who they actually are when everything external has been stripped away, including sleep, warmth, certainty, and the comfort of being told they're doing well. Mara arrived at the assessment and selection phase in November, which meant cold. Real cold. The kind that seeps into joints and makes the simplest physical task require twice the mental engagement it normally would. There were 9 candidates in her cohort. 2 women, 7 men. All of them experienced. All of them selected because they had already demonstrated something worth watching more closely. The other woman, a special operations aviation officer named Captain Dana Holt, was eliminated on day 4 with a leg injury that nobody questioned and everyone respected. After that, Mara was alone in a particular way that's difficult to describe if you've never experienced it. Not isolated. Not unfriendly. But singular in a way that made every performance, every evaluation, every stumble carry a weight that it didn't carry for the others. She understood what that meant. She didn't resent it. She treated it as additional information about the environment she was operating in, and she adjusted accordingly. The physical demands were what they were. She met them. Not always first. Not always fastest. But with a consistency that the evaluators noted quietly in reports that Mara would never read. What she exceeded in ways that even the most skeptical of her assessors couldn't ignore was the precision work. The marksmanship evaluations. The intelligence-based target acquisition exercises. The long static observation drills where candidates lay in a hide for hours, identifying, cataloging, and reporting on enemy activity through a scope while battling discomfort and fatigue. One of the senior evaluators, a weathered Navy Master Chief named Erickson who had been through BUDSS twice and spent 12 years in operational teams, watched her during one of the observation exercises and said nothing for a long time. Then he walked away and wrote 4 words in his assessment ledger that he rarely used about anyone. She doesn't miss anything. But the pipeline also included something that no formal evaluation document captured accurately. And that was the culture of a unit adapting to something it wasn't entirely sure it had chosen to adapt to. Some of the men were professional, respectful, and entirely focused on capability. Others were not hostile but were quietly doubtful in a way that communicated itself in small and persistent forms. A sniper course assessment score that was acknowledged in the room with a beat of silence before someone changed the subject. A tactical planning exercise where her proposed solution was initially credited to the wrong person. A comment made half under someone's breath in the chow line that was just loud enough to hear. Mara never addressed these moments directly. Not because she was afraid to, but because she understood something that took some people their entire careers to learn. That responding to doubt with anger gave doubt a kind of power it hadn't earned. She responded to doubt by being completely, undeniably, documentably better the next time she had a rifle in her hands or a map on a table. She graduated. She earned her position in the Naval Special Warfare community as a sniper with a command support designation, which meant she could be embedded with SEAL teams in a command, intelligence, and direct action support role. She was assigned to DEVGRU support element, working under a command structure that included some of the most experienced special operations officers in the American military. On the day of her first briefing with the team she'd be supporting, she walked into a room of 11 male operators who looked at her with varying degrees of neutrality and skepticism. The team's senior chief, a veteran named Garrett Voss with 15 years of deployments and a face like a weathered cliff face, looked at her for a long moment across the table. She met his gaze and held it without performance. It was the beginning of something, though neither of them knew yet what it would cost. Afghanistan in November is a particular kind of brutal. The mountains trap the cold and release it slowly, the way a landscape does when it has been rehearsing indifference for centuries. The forward operating base where Mara's team was stationed sat at an elevation that made breathing slightly harder, which made everything else slightly harder. Which was the kind of condition you either learned to integrate or it slowly unraveled you. She had been on 3 previous deployments. 2 in a support intelligence capacity, 1 in a direct advisory role. None of them had put her in the kind of forward operational environment she was stepping into now. She knew this. She prepared for it the same way she prepared for everything, by removing every variable she could control and making peace with the one she couldn't. The team she was assigned to support was led by Commander Paul Reardon, a SEAL officer with an impressive operational record and a leadership style that was simultaneously professional and, at a frequency too low for most people to detect, fundamentally dismissive of her presence. He wasn't hostile. He was precise and measured in the way that men sometimes are when they've decided someone isn't a threat and therefore isn't worth the energy of real engagement. He gave her the briefings. He included her in the planning sessions. He read her analysis reports and occasionally acted on them without acknowledging where the insight originated. He assigned her to overwatch positions on operations that were important but not the highest risk insertions. It was a form of management that was entirely deniable and almost entirely effective at containing someone who didn't have the rank or the established trust to push back without looking like they were making everything about themselves. Garrett Voss, the senior chief, watched this dynamic with the careful attention of a man who had seen many versions of it over a long career. He wasn't certain how he felt about Mara yet. He'd spent enough time in combat to know that opinion was worthless compared to performance, and he hadn't yet seen her perform at the level this environment demanded. But he was fair in the methodical way that good senior enlisted leaders are fair, which meant he watched, reserved judgment, and when he had an opinion, it was going to be based on what he actually saw. Mara's first major Overwatch assignment came on an intelligence-driven raid targeting a mid-level network commander in a village compound 12 kilometers east of the base. She was positioned on a ridgeline 400 meters north of the compound, providing eyes and a sniper overwatch position for the assault element moving through the village. The raid went mostly according to plan. Mostly. There was a secondary exit point that the pre-mission intelligence hadn't identified, and 2 targets broke contact through a narrow alley that wasn't covered by the assault team. Mara saw them before anyone else did, tracked them through her scope, relayed their position, direction of movement, and speed over the radio in a rapid but precise burst of information that gave the blocking element exactly enough time to reposition and contain the threat without a shot being fired. Reardon acknowledged the communication in the debrief. Factually. Without weight. Voss wrote something in his notebook during that debrief. It was a habit he had, noting things that he believed deserved more attention than they received in the moment. He didn't share it with anyone. Not yet. 3 weeks later, on a night operation that Mara wasn't assigned to, 2 operators were hit by small arms fired during an exfil sequence. She heard the call come over the radio from the base operations center while she was cleaning her rifle in the armory. She put the rifle down, pulled up the Overwatch imagery from the base feeds, and spent 40 minutes working through the terrain, the enemy's movement pattern, and the origin point of the contact. By the time the team returned and the dust had partially settled, she had a detailed analysis of the enemy's likely alternate position already prepared. Nobody had asked for it. She placed it on the table in the operation room and went back to the armory to finish cleaning her rifle. Voss found the document. He read it twice. The mission that broke everything open had been 2 weeks in the making. A high-value target had been tracked to a compound network in the Eastern Valley, and the intelligence picture, built from signals intercepts, aerial observation, and 2 separate source reporting chains, suggested a window of approximately 72 hours before the target moved again. Reardon had been planning the operation with characteristic thoroughness, and Mara had been involved in the intelligence shaping phase, which meant she had seen more of the terrain analysis and positional data than almost anyone else on the team. The planned operation had Mara in an overwatch position on the southern ridgeline, supporting the primary assault element from a distance. It was the same assignment type she'd received on every previous mission. Reardon had designated 2 of his senior snipers to the more exposed northern ridge position that gave the best combined line of sight over the compound's primary approaches. When Mara reviewed the terrain model and the satellite imagery together, she saw something in the slope of the eastern ridge that changed the geometry of the problem. She brought it to Reardon's attention 24 hours before the operation. She explained, with the maps and imagery laid out on the table between them, that the eastern ridgeline offered a field of fire that covered all 3 of the compound's exit routes simultaneously. Something neither the northern nor the southern positions could achieve alone. She also pointed out that the vegetation pattern on the eastern ridge provided superior natural concealment for a single sniper, reducing the risk of compromise before the assault element was in position. Reardon listened. He looked at the imagery. He thanked her for the analysis and said the current plan was sound. She didn't push further. She went back to her position. But Voss had been standing near the edge of the room during that conversation, and he studied the maps for a long time after Reardon left. He didn't say anything either. The operation launched at 0230. The assault element moved into position. The 2 snipers deployed to the northern ridge. Mara took her assigned position on the southern ridgeline, 460 meters from the compound's main gate. For the first 20 minutes, everything was quiet in the controlled, alert way that military quiet is never actually quiet. Then the assault element made entry. And simultaneously, from a position that the intelligence picture had marked as low probability for enemy presence. Approximately 40 fighters began moving from 3 separate directions toward the compound, channeled by the terrain directly toward the assault element's position and both exit corridors. Someone had known the team was coming. Or someone had been watching the valley long enough to anticipate a pattern. The northern ridge snipers saw the eastern movement and began calling contact, but their angles were wrong for the western approach and the southern channel. The assault element fell back to a fortified interior position inside the compound. Reardon, who was moving with the command element, took shrapnel from a grenade that blew out the compound's eastern wall and went down with wounds to his leg and side that were serious but not immediately fatal. The team medic, a calm and capable man named Doyle, got to him within seconds and started working. 11 men. Pinned. 3 directions of contact. Extraction 17 minutes out. And on the southern ridge, 460 meters away, Lieutenant Commander Mara Calloway looked through her scope at the landscape and began calculating. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. Reardon was down. And the senior chief had assumed acting command and was directing the team's internal defense from inside the compound while trying to coordinate extraction on a radio net that was partially degraded by terrain interference. Mara had been running her own net simultaneously for 60 seconds before she keyed up and gave the single transmission that would define the next 5 minutes. I have eyes on the eastern ridge. Don't move. Give me 4 minutes. The eastern approach had 8 fighters moving in a loose file along a draw that concealed them from the compound's walls but not from her elevated position on the southern ridge. They were moving fast, closing the distance, using the cover of the terrain as if they'd rehearsed this approach. From the northern ridge, they were invisible. From inside the compound, they were seconds away from being a catastrophic problem. She settled into the rifle. The cold was irrelevant. The altitude was irrelevant. The 17 months of preparation, the early mornings in Pennsylvania, the training pipeline, the range sessions that nobody applauded. The analysis documents placed quietly on tables in operation rooms, all of it condensed into the simple and absolute discipline of a shooter in a hide making decisions at the intersection of physics, patience, and controlled intention. The first shot dropped the lead fighter at 380 meters. Before the sound fully registered in the draw, she had already acquired the second target. Adjusted for the fractional change in wind that her flag markers on the ridge had been telegraphing for 20 minutes, and fired again. 2 down. The file broke into individual movement, fighters splitting left and right, seeking cover. which was the correct response and also the one she had anticipated, because the terrain on both sides of the draw funneled them into positions she had already ranged and marked in her scope reticle. She moved through the next 4 shots with a rhythm that the operators inside the compound, listening to the firing pattern over the course of seconds, would later describe with a quiet kind of awe. Measured. Deliberate. Absolutely controlled. 6 down on the eastern approach. The remaining 2 fighters on that vector had gone to ground and were not advancing. She shifted her position by 3 meters, using a pre-identified secondary firing point she had selected when she first arrived on the ridge 2 hours before the operation launched. The western approach had 4 fighters moving toward the compound's blind corner, a position that the assault team inside couldn't cover without breaking their defensive perimeter. The light was poor on the western approach. The targets were partially obscured by a low stone wall and moving in short bounds. She slowed her breathing further. She let 2 of the bounds happen, watching the pattern, measuring the intervals. Then she picked the point where the geometry aligned and she had a clear angle, and she worked through the 4 shots in a sequence that took less than 90 seconds. 10 down. The 2 remaining fighters on the eastern approach had begun to move again, believing perhaps that the shooting had stopped. She was back to her primary position. 2 more shots. Controlled. Deliberate. Irreversible. 12 combatants. 5 minutes. 11 men who would live to fly home. The extraction helicopter arrived 16 minutes later. By the time it landed, the compound was secure, the assault element had consolidated, and Mara had carefully, methodically, without any performance or announcement, begun the process of policing her position and preparing for movement back to the extraction point. Voss was the first to see her when she came through the compound's western gate. He looked at her for a long moment in the way that men look at something they have fundamentally reassessed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He stepped aside and held the gate open for her, and that simple gesture communicated something that a formal evaluation report never could. Doyle, still working on Reardon's wounds while they waited for the helicopter, looked up when she walked past. Reardon was conscious, pale, and clearly in significant pain. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Reardon said, quietly and without any elaboration, "Good shooting, Commander." She nodded once and went to check on the other wounded. The debrief happened 48 hours later, after the wounded had been stabilized and evacuated and the operational report had been filed with the command element back at the base. It was not a celebratory environment. Debriefs never are. They are detailed, unflinching examinations of everything that went right and everything that went wrong. And a great deal had gone wrong on this operation before the last 5 minutes made it survivable. The intelligence failure would be investigated at length. The question of how the enemy had anticipated the operation's timing and approach was a serious one with serious implications for the entire network. Reardon's plan, including the sniper positioning decisions, would be analyzed and reviewed. These were important and necessary conversations, and Mara engaged in all of them with the same precision she brought to everything else. But there was also a different kind of conversation happening, quieter and less formal, in the corridors and common areas of the forward operating base in the days after the operation. The kind of conversation that moves through a unit not in formal language but in the way people address someone, the way they make space in a room, the way they listen when a person speaks. Mara noticed the change. She didn't perform any reaction to it. It was not vindication she had been seeking. It was never about that. She had been preparing to do a specific job to the highest possible standard, and she had done it. The recognition that followed was real and she accepted it with the same steadiness she had brought to the years of doubt that preceded it. Voss requested a separate meeting with her on the 3rd day after the operation. He brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her at a small table in the empty briefing room and told her, in the blunt and considered language of a man who had been measuring his words for 30 years, that he owed her a professional acknowledgement that he should have made months earlier. That he had watched her work and withheld confidence that she had earned, and that this was a failure of his own that he intended to correct. She told him she appreciated it and that she understood the environment they were both operating in. He said that understanding it didn't make it acceptable. She agreed with that too. It was one of the most honest professional conversations she had ever had in uniform, and it happened over 2 cups of bad forward operating base coffee in a room with no windows. Which was exactly the kind of setting where real things tend to get said in the military. Reardon was evacuated to Landstuhl for treatment of his wounds. He would recover fully and return to operational status several months later. Before he was transported, he requested that Mara's role in the operation be formally documented in the unit's after-action report with specific detail about the fire support decisions she made, the firing solution she developed independently, and the outcome it produced. He made this request without being asked, and he made it to the command element in writing. It was a small thing and a significant one simultaneously. The formal documentation of what she had done would eventually move through the system. She would receive a commendation for valor in a ceremony attended by her team, her commanding officer, and several officers from the broader special operations community. She would stand in her uniform in the same kind of room she had walked into 2 years earlier, except this time, when she walked in, the room rearranged itself differently around her presence. In the months that followed, she returned to the training environment as an instructor. The decision was partly hers and partly the result of a broader recognition within the command structure that her capabilities had value that extended beyond a single deployment or a single mission. She taught sniper fundamentals, observation discipline, field craft, and target analysis to mixed cohorts of operators who were learning to do the same work she had spent a decade mastering. She was not an easy instructor. She was exacting in the way that people are when they understand the real consequences of imprecision. She held her students to standards that felt severe until the moment they understood why those standards existed. Several of her students would later say in various ways that she was the most demanding instructor they'd encountered, and also the most honest. That she never told them they were doing well unless they were actually doing well, and that when she told you something needed to improve, she also stayed until you improved it. This was, in every meaningful way, exactly who she had always been. It had just taken a very specific set of 5 minutes in a valley in eastern Kandahar for the rest of the world to catch up. She never stopped going to the range. She never stopped measuring the gap between where she was and where the work required her to be. The early mornings remained early. The cold still felt like cold. The rifle still required cleaning after every session. None of that changed, because for Mara Calloway, it was never supposed to change. The preparation wasn't a phase you moved through on the way to something else. It was the thing itself. The mission and the preparation for the next one were not separate categories. They were one continuous discipline that you committed to fully or not at all. She understood this in a way that was not philosophical but entirely practical. She had lived the consequence of preparation. She had stood on a cold ridge in the dark and converted a decade of quiet, unwitnessed work into 11 lives. That was the arithmetic of it. That was what all those early mornings had been building toward. It was enough. It was more than enough. And she was already thinking about the next one. There is a version of this story that gets told differently, the version where the 5 minutes in the valley are the whole story. The spectacular moment lifted out of context and placed against a backdrop of dramatic music and slow-motion imagery. That version is not wrong, exactly. Those 5 minutes were real and they mattered profoundly to the 11 people who lived because of them. But the honest version of this story begins long before the shooting starts. It begins in Pennsylvania, with a girl who held still and breathed correctly and hit a target on her second shot. It begins in a training pipeline in November cold, where a woman lay in a hide for hours without moving and saw everything. It begins in a briefing room where an analysis report was placed on a table without attribution and picked up by the only person in the room who was looking closely enough to understand its value. Mara Calloway was underestimated not because she lacked evidence of her capability. She was underestimated because the environment around her had a habit of looking in certain directions and not others. Because excellence, when it comes in a form that challenges an existing assumption, tends to have to prove itself twice as precisely before it receives half as much acknowledgement. She understood this and she didn't let it make her bitter. She let it make her better. She let it deepen her preparation, sharpen her focus, and clarify her understanding of what the work actually required. She was not building a case for herself. She was building capability for the mission. The fact that both things arrived at the same destination at the same moment, on a ridgeline in the eastern Kandahar Valley, was not coincidence. It was the outcome of a life organized around preparation and the refusal to stop. What her story represents for women in uniform is not a simple or clean message. It is not a victory that resolved all the complexity that preceded it. There were costs she carried that this narration cannot fully account for. The weight of being the person who always has to prove the point again, who cannot afford the margin of error that others take for granted. Who walks into rooms that were not designed for her and must choose, every single day, between the exhaustion of proving herself and the danger of not. She chose to prove herself. Not loudly. Not with performance or anger or the kind of statement making that announces its own intention. She chose it quietly, on ranges and in hides and in briefing rooms, one precise and undeniable action at a time. The lesson her story carries is simple, but it does not diminish with repetition. The most capable person in the room is not always the most immediately visible one. The most dangerous operator on the ridge is not always the one the enemy expects. The person who saves 11 lives in 5 minutes is sometimes the person who spent years being told, in small and persistent ways, that they weren't quite right for this. Strength does not ask for permission. Preparation does not require an audience. And sometimes, the person everyone underestimated is the one who changes everything. Lieutenant Commander Mara Calloway earned her place not with a single moment, but with 10,000 smaller ones that nobody watched and nobody applauded, and that mattered more than any of them knew. That is what a soldier looks like. That is what it costs. And that is why it matters.